Jesus and his disciples passed through Galilee. He did not want anyone to know it, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, "The Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him. And 3 days after being killed, he will rise again." But they did not understand what he was saying and were afraid to ask him. Then they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you arguing about on the way?" But they were silent, for on the way they had argued with one another who was the greatest. He sat down, called the 12, and said to them, "Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all." Then he took a little child and put it among them, and taking it in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me." The Gospel of the Lord. One of the greatest people I have never met is Diana Cisneros. That's right, not ever met, but never met. She and I had arranged to speak at 2 o'clock last Sunday afternoon, but she avoided my phone call, or so I thought. It happens sometimes. People agree to speak with you about painful personal experiences, and then they change their minds. Often it is, for them, like reliving it all over again. What if there are public repercussions? It's a little like feeling crucified. Diana is a survivor of human trafficking, and I was eager to talk to her for a story I was working on about how the Episcopal Diocese of San Joaquin is working to raise awareness about this form of modern-day slavery. When Diana didn't answer her phone or return my call, I was convinced that she was fearful and had changed her mind about being vulnerable. What she was doing, however, was rescuing someone else from the same fate that had befallen her. All of which I learned when she called me back on Monday of this week. My husband was on his way to church, and he saw this young girl running from a hotel room, she said, with no shoes on. It was a red flag to him. So she said that her husband pulled over the car, and he stopped the girl and began to talk to her. She turned out to be a victim of human trafficking. We were able to get her help and to get her to a safe place. Now, Diana is 29, and she lives in Bakersfield. She described to me how her father, a preacher, began selling her for sex to local men when she was just 7 years old. At 16, she ran away and eventually was helped by relatives in another state. She estimates that there are about 300,000 girls and boys in this country at risk for being exploited in this way. Human trafficking happens anytime fraud or force or coercion is used to pigeonhole people into migrant work or sexual situations for profit. Most often, these victims are invisible in the normal course of daily life. Actual numbers are hard to come by, but some sources, like the website dosomething.org, say the numbers of such modern-day slaves range between 20 and 30 million worldwide. 20 and 30 million worldwide. It is the world's fastest-growing criminal enterprise, and California has 4 major hotspots: LA, San Diego, San Francisco, and the Central Valley, where Diana lives. She said the experience broke her down spiritually, made her afraid of people, afraid to trust anyone. But with the supportive friends she had and some family members, she got help. She has earned a master's degree in psychology and has dedicated her life to raising awareness, to helping others. At the least, she says, every one of us should be armed at all times with a toll-free hotline number to call to offer someone else who might appear to need help. Traffickers have a network of people they work with, and if every one of us gets educated, we can be part of an anti-trafficking network, she said. The wider our network is, the more victims we are going to be able to help. We never really learn from today's gospel what criteria the disciples are using to determine greatness. But notice how, when questioned about it, they just fall silent. How they really would rather not have to explain it to Jesus after all. Jesus and the disciples have moved on from Caesarea Philippi. They are headed toward Jerusalem and the cross, and Jesus is trying to establish them as a network of servant leaders. It is no longer a time for teaching the crowds. Jesus is focused on teaching the disciples what greatness, what service, what his life means, and teaching them that in spite of his coming betrayal, trial, and crucifixion, he will face down death. He will rise again. Teaching them that though there are some difficult days ahead, hope, grace, and greatness lie within all of them, within their service to and for others. This, of course, is not their idea of the kingdom. They long for power and praise, while Jesus is servant of all. Jesus, who teaches, heals, forgives, loves, surrenders all. He grabs a child who has no power, no influence, no wealth, and no prestige, a vulnerable child with his or her own set of needs. And the meaning is clear. If the disciples welcome any person with no power, no wealth, no prestige, they are welcoming Jesus and welcoming the opportunity to serve. In other words, Jesus is saying that God's kingdom belongs to those to whom the world has said nothing belongs. You may have heard of a book. The title is called "This Child Will Be Great." It's the story of Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the first woman elected president in the African nation of Liberia. She is the first woman head of state anywhere on the entire African continent. When she was born, a family friend predicted that this child will be great. Now, of course, through the years, her life appeared to be anything but. She married while still a teenager, had 4 children and an abusive husband. But she never gave up hope. She worked her way through college, even attended Harvard, became an international banking executive. And during 14 years of civil war and violence in Liberia, she was thrown into prison numerous times, and when released, was forced more than once to flee the country in fear of her life. I first heard about her book and about her life when I reported a story about her visit a few years ago to St. Timothy's Episcopal School in Compton. President Sirleaf was visiting one of her sons who was in college here in the United States. And a friend of her son's, a man named Robert, is an alumnus of St. Timothy's. Now, if you know anything about Compton, you know that it's a pretty tough place. St. Timothy's was a small, struggling school, yet not too small for a presidential visit. It was a moment of pure grace, as Robert Presley, the alumnus, told the St. Timothy students that he had invited President Sirleaf to the school because he wanted to inspire them, to give them a gift they would remember for the rest of their lives. Now, President Sirleaf told them that day that what had motivated her to seek the presidency of Liberia was its children. Think about what it would be like, she said, if you couldn't go to school. Or if you did, there were no books. If the only light you had was a candle, no electricity. To get water, you had to draw it from a well. You couldn't turn on the faucet because all the pipes were broken or stolen during the years of wars. Think about what it would be like if you were taught to use a gun and to kill, to even destroy your own families. She said that women have always been second-class citizens, but in the end it was their hope, their determination for a new and better country that won the election. The women who went from village to village, tirelessly campaigning for a unified Liberia. If your dreams don't scare you, you're not dreaming big enough, she said. Dream big and then go for your dreams, she told St. Timothy's students that day. And no matter how difficult it may seem, stay the course. There are all sorts of ways that the world defines greatness, by wealth, by fame, by possessions, but none of it is lasting. But each of us is here today because of a higher calling. We ask God to deliver us from the presumption that it is in any way up to us to decide who deserves what we all want for ourselves and for our children. We ask God to give us the vision and courage to receive every single child, not just those we know or like, or just those with whom we share a common culture or language or social class, or a legal or genetic family link, but every single child as a full, beloved member of God's family, as deserving as are we to share the good things that are God's gifts and not just our property. And we evaluate every system, every power, every choice based on what it will do for the most vulnerable, not for those closest to us. That's the key to God's economy of pure grace. Perhaps more than anyone else in our modern times, Dietrich Bonhoeffer struggled with this question of suffering and how we understand it and ourselves in light of the meaning and the mystery of the cross. As you probably know, Bonhoeffer was a pastor and a theologian, a professor of theology, who, in spite of many warnings otherwise, returned from the United States to his native Germany once Hitler rose to power there. Even though he knew he would face certain death, he believed so strongly that we must share the sufferings of others that he became actively involved in the resistance movement. He was forced to choose between his faith and his country and to face persecution. After he was imprisoned in a Nazi concentration camp, he wrote that he was sure of God's hand and of God's guidance even in prison. He ministered to the other prisoners. He believed that our identity as Christians means that we must always be willing to suffer martyrdom and even death. This was the cost of discipleship. This was the price Jesus paid for us. It is a costly grace, he said, but the only way in which we can ever hope to learn true faith. He believed that when we give up trying to make something of ourselves and instead just throw ourselves into the arms of God, then we wake with Christ in Gethsemane. Whether we are a saint or a converted sinner, a righteous or an unrighteous person, a success or a failure, we must throw ourselves into the arms of God. And that, said Bonhoeffer, is the essence of faith. So the good news of the gospel, the pure grace that Jesus was attempting to share with his misunderstanding disciples, is that we are never alone, no matter where we are. That Jesus' death for us destroyed death, and we have hope now and in the future, as St. Paul says, in the glory that is to be revealed in all of us. The Nazis executed Bonhoeffer a few days before the concentration camp was liberated. But those who saw him during the last hours of his life said that he went to his death peacefully with his faith unshaken. there is always the potential to face those things that break us down, that challenge us. But God's grace is greater. God's pure grace gives us strength to hold on, courage to not lose hope, confidence to know that we are not alone, the ability to never let others define us. God's pure grace comes to us freely, openly, and trusting, and as vulnerable as a little child, leading us straight into the arms of God. Amen.